At 2:13 in the morning, the rain came down hard enough to blur the city lights into long, trembling lines across the tinted windows of Evelyn Cross's car. She sat in the back seat with her blazer still buttoned, her silk blouse untouched beneath it, her tie loosened only slightly, a minor concession to exhaustion that she would never have allowed in public. Her phone lay face down beside her because she could not bear to look at another headline. For the past 16 hours, every person in the Cross Biotech crisis room had spoken in numbers. Manufacturing costs, trial failures, investor pressure, patient pools, projected losses. They had all circled the same decision again and again, trying to defend the price increase of Seraphine, the pheromone-stabilizing drug for omegas whose bodies could no longer regulate safely on their own. Evelyn had defended it too. She had done it with a calm voice, a steady gaze, and the kind of logic that made board members nod even when the world outside was furious. Rare medicine was expensive to build. Failed research had to be paid for somehow. Without margins, future treatments would die before they were born. She knew the argument so well that it no longer felt like an argument. It felt like a wall, one she had spent years building around herself. The car stopped in front of a 24-hour pharmacy, and Evelyn stepped out before her driver could open the door. She only needed her own prescription. Something mild enough to pass a medical review, but strong enough to force her mind into silence for a few hours. The rain hit her shoulders immediately, cold and sharp, seeping through the wool of her blazer. She ignored it and walked toward the glass doors glowing under the pharmacy sign. She was almost at the entrance when a small hand caught the sleeve of her coat. "Ma'am," a child's voice said, strained but carefully polite. "Can you help my mama stand up?" Evelyn turned. For a moment, the scene in front of her did not fit into the clean, controlled world she had left behind. An Omega woman was collapsed beside a concrete planter near the pharmacy doors, soaked through from the rain. One arm braced weakly against the ground, as if her body had stopped obeying her halfway through the simple act of standing. A torn pharmacy bag lay beside her knee, and an orange pill bottle had rolled into a shallow puddle, its white label catching the neon light each time the rain disturbed the water. The child beside her looked no older than 6. She was wearing a winter coat too large for her small frame, the sleeves bunched around her wrists, and she clutched a worn canvas bag against her chest with both arms, as if it contained everything she and her mother had left. She was not wailing or panicking. She was trying to be brave in the trained, unnatural way of a child who had been frightened too many times before. Evelyn moved closer, and the air shifted before she could stop it. Beneath the smell of rain and wet pavement, an unstable omega pheromone trembled through the cold, faint but broken, as if it had been suppressed until the body carrying it could no longer hold the barrier in place. The scent hit Evelyn's alpha instincts with the force of a physical blow, tightening through her chest and shoulders with an old, primitive command: approach, stabilize, protect, control. The force of it surprised her, not because she had never felt an omega in distress, but because this one cut through her exhaustion with startling clarity, sharp, raw, and unmistakably wrong in a way that made her blood run cold. The omega lifted her head. Though her face was pale with pain and her dark hair plastered against her cheeks, her eyes were sharply awake. She saw Evelyn's movement, saw the instinct before the other woman acted on it, and her voice came out ragged but firm. "Don't touch me like I'm not a person anymore." Evelyn stopped immediately. The words cut through the alpha impulse more cleanly than any suppressant could have. She lowered her hand before it fully rose and took half a step back, enough to make the distance visible. The Omega's pheromones still called to her, a desperate tremor beneath the cold rain, but Evelyn forced herself to breathe through it. "All right," she said, keeping her voice low. "I won't touch you unless you ask." The child looked between them, frightened by the tension she did not fully understand. "Mama," she whispered, tugging at the Omega's sleeve. "She can help you. We should ask grown-ups when it's dangerous." "I know, Meera," the Omega murmured, and even then, even while her arm shook beneath her, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled tissue. With careful fingers, she slid it under her bare palms so her skin would not press directly against the freezing wet ground. "Count for me first." "We count before I try, remember." The girl nodded quickly. 1, 2, 3. Evelyn watched in silence as the Omega tried to gather her strength. The woman's pride was not loud, but it was there in every controlled breath, in the way she refused to collapse fully, and in the way she kept her daughter occupied with a ritual that made fear feel like order. Evelyn had watched powerful executives tremble in boardrooms under less pressure than this, yet this Omega on the pavement was still teaching a child how not to be afraid. When the count reached 7, the Omega tried to push herself upward. But her shoulder gave out, and her body tilted dangerously toward the planter. Evelyn's instinct surged again. Catch her, steady her, keep her safe. But this time she did not reach for the woman directly. Instead, she removed her blazer, folded it once, and laid it across the rough concrete edge where the Omega had been trying to brace herself. "Use this," Evelyn said. "It will give you a better grip." The Omega stared at the blazer with suspicion and humiliation flickering together in her eyes. For a moment, it seemed as though she would rather fall than accept it. Then Meera whispered, "Please, Mama," and something in her expression softened, just enough for her to take the fabric. Slowly, painfully, she pulled herself upright until she was sitting against the planter, breathing hard while rain slid down her face. Evelyn stayed where she was, close enough to help if the woman asked, far enough away to prove she had heard the first warning. "Do you need an ambulance?" Evelyn asked. "No," the Omega answered quickly. Meera's mouth tightened, but she did not argue. Evelyn's gaze shifted to the pill bottle in the puddle. The label had turned toward her now, and the name printed across it was impossible to miss. Seraphine. For a second, the cold seemed to sink through her coat and settle under her ribs. Evelyn bent and picked up the bottle, water running over her fingers. The receipt was stuck to the side, half torn but still legible, and when she peeled it back, the bold number printed near the bottom stared at her with the blunt cruelty of a fact no boardroom language could soften. $1,245. The Omega saw her expression change and reached out sharply. "Give it back." Evelyn handed it over without resistance. "Is that your copay?" The Omega shoved the bottle into the torn bag, as if the question itself was an insult. "It's my problem." "It became my problem when you collapsed outside a pharmacy carrying my company's drug," Evelyn said, and regretted the phrasing as soon as the words left her mouth. The Omega went still. Her eyes dropped to the blazer beneath her hand, and there, on the inner lining, the small cross Biotech emblem was visible against the dark fabric. The fragile truce between them vanished so quickly that the air felt colder. "You're from Cross Biotech," she said. Evelyn did not deny it. The Omega's fingers tightened around the wet pharmacy bag. Her body was still trembling, her scent, even now, even through the rain, carried the sickly sweet edges of a destabilized system, and yet the look she gave Evelyn was no longer vulnerable. It was wounded, furious, and devastatingly clear. "No," she whispered. "You're not from Cross." Meera looked up, confused and afraid, still holding her mother's bag with both arms. The Omega stared straight into Evelyn's eyes and said, "You were Cross." Rain beat against the glass doors behind them, and for the first time in years, Evelyn Cross had no prepared answer waiting behind her silence. For several long seconds after Lena said those words, neither of them moved. Rain continued striking the pavement around them while the pharmacy doors slid open and closed behind passing customers, letting brief flashes of warm fluorescent light spill onto the sidewalk before disappearing again. Evelyn stood there, with the cold soaking slowly through her blouse, watching the Omega in front of her struggle to remain upright through sheer stubbornness alone. Meera was the first to break the silence. "Mama," she whispered carefully, tugging at Lena's sleeve. "You're shaking again." Lena inhaled slowly, as if forcing her body to cooperate through discipline rather than strength. "I'm fine." The lie was obvious to everyone standing there. Even now, Evelyn could feel traces of unstable pheromones lingering in the air around Lena, thin enough that most people might not notice, but impossible for an alpha to completely ignore. The scent carried exhaustion more than sweetness, and beneath it sat something raw that made Evelyn's instincts remain painfully alert. Her alpha instincts. The realization struck her with uncomfortable precision. She had spent a decade training herself to override those responses, to treat them as biological noise unworthy of consideration. But tonight, standing in the rain with this Omega's distress pressing against her senses like a physical weight, the old programming was fighting back harder than it had in years. "Your suppressive levels are crashing," Evelyn said quietly. "You shouldn't be standing outside in this condition." Lena gave a short laugh without humor. "And yet here I am." Evelyn normally hated conversations like this. She hated emotional confrontations, hated situations without structure, hated people forcing morality into decisions that were supposed to be practical. In the boardroom, everything had a risk-cost calculation. Sustainability. Market limitation. Tonight, standing under freezing rain while a sick Omega held together what little dignity she still had, those categories suddenly felt thinner than usual. "You need the full dosage," Evelyn said. "Missing stabilizers for this long is dangerous." Lena's expression sharpened instantly. "I know exactly how dangerous it is." There was something in her tone that made Evelyn pause, not fear, not ignorance. Experience. The pharmacy doors opened again, and a gust of warm air rolled outside. A pharmacist glanced toward them nervously before recognizing Evelyn's face from recent news coverage. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, then quickly darted away. Meera noticed the movement too. "Mama," she murmured quietly. "People are staring." Lena straightened a little at that, immediately trying to gather herself, despite the visible strain it put on her body. Evelyn watched the reaction carefully. The Omega was clearly used to attention turning dangerous very quickly. "We should get inside," Evelyn said. "I already paid for half the prescription," Lena replied. "That's all I can take tonight." Evelyn frowned. "Half?" Lena avoided her eyes. That answer alone told Evelyn enough. "You've been cutting doses." "I've been surviving." The words landed harder than Evelyn expected. Inside the pharmacy, fluorescent lights hummed overhead while rainwater dripped from the edges of their coats onto the tiled floor. A few late-night customers looked up from the aisles. Almost immediately, some recognized Evelyn, while others recognized the signs of an Omega in distress. None of the attention felt kind. Meera moved closer against Lena's side instinctively. Evelyn stepped toward the counter and removed a black card from her wallet. "Ring up the remaining prescription." "No." Lena's voice cut through the pharmacy sharply enough that even the cashier froze. Evelyn turned toward her. "You need the medication. And you need to stop deciding things for people because you can afford to." "That isn't what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing?" Lena asked, breathing unevenly now, though whether from anger or physical exhaustion, Evelyn could not tell. "Trying to ease your conscience?" Evelyn's jaw tightened slightly. Normally, she would have ended the conversation there. She had spent years learning how to stay emotionally untouchable in public. But something about Lena's expression kept pulling responses out of her before she could suppress them. You think I came here looking for forgiveness? She asked. I think women like you are only comfortable helping when it stays temporary. For the first time since the meeting ended, Evelyn felt irritation break cleanly through her exhaustion. You know nothing about me. Lena met her gaze without hesitation. I know your company bought my research division, fired most of the Omega staff within 6 months, absorbed our patents, and turned the drug we helped create into something people like me can't afford anymore. Silence settled heavily between them. Even the cashier stopped pretending not to listen. Evelyn lowered the card slowly. You worked on Seraphine? I worked on the stabilization foundation before Cross Biotech acquired the lab, Lena replied. We warned them from the beginning that inconsistent dosing would become dangerous for long-term Omega patients. Evelyn felt something uncomfortable twist beneath her ribs. That information should have sounded familiar. Instead, she realized with sudden clarity that she had probably never even seen the original research team's names. Acquisitions passed across executive tables all the time. Most were reduced to summaries before reaching her. Data in, cost out, patents secured. The people disappeared somewhere in the middle. Meera looked up at Evelyn quietly then, her small face serious in a way children should never have to be. Are you the reason Mama's medicine costs so much? The question hit harder than any accusation Lena had thrown at her. Evelyn opened her mouth automatically, ready with the same explanation she had repeated all week. Research costs billions. Rare disease treatment requires sustainable margins. Failed trials must be funded somehow. Standing there beside a tired child holding a damaged pharmacy bag against her chest, the words suddenly sounded mechanical, even inside her own head. Lena noticed the hesitation immediately. That's the problem, she said softly. You probably do have reasons. Real ones. Logical ones. None of those reasons matter much when an Omega has to choose between rent and stabilizers. Evelyn looked at her carefully then. Lena was exhausted, soaked from the rain, clearly struggling to remain standing, and still there was no trace of self-pity in her. Anger, yes. Humiliation, definitely. But beneath it all sat something stronger and far more stubborn, pride. The kind that survived even after life had stripped almost everything else away. A sudden voice interrupted from nearby. Oh my God, that's Evelyn Cross. Someone near the vitamin aisle had lifted a phone. Another customer immediately turned to look. Meera stiffened at once. Lena's entire body reacted almost instantly, shoulders drawing inward with an instinctive fear that felt practiced rather than dramatic. Evelyn noticed it immediately. This was not the first time attention had turned ugly around her. The phone tilted higher. Get a better angle, someone whispered. Evelyn moved before thinking. She stepped directly between the camera and Lena, broad enough to block most of the view without physically threatening anyone. She collapsed outside a pharmacy, Evelyn said evenly. Not on a stage for your entertainment. The customer hesitated, uncomfortable now that the CEO herself was looking directly at her. After a moment, the phone lowered slightly. The tension in the pharmacy remained thick anyway. Beside her, Evelyn heard Lena exhale slowly through shaking breath, not relieved, just tired. Meera tugged weakly on her mother's sleeve. Mama, can we go home? Lena looked down at her, and something in her expression softened immediately despite everything else. Then her knees almost gave out. Evelyn reacted on instinct, one hand catching Lena's elbow before she hit the floor. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds, but in that moment, skin met fabric and unstable Omega pheromones flared sharply between them. Lena froze. Evelyn did too. For one dangerous instant, Evelyn's alpha instincts surged hard enough to tighten every muscle in her body. Stabilize her. Hold her steady. Keep her close. The The scent hit her like a wave, exhaustion and fear, and something deeper beneath it, something that made Evelyn's pulse hammer in her throat. She released Lena immediately. "I'm fine," Lena said too quickly, stepping back despite how pale she had become. "No," Evelyn replied quietly. "You're really not." Meera looked between them anxiously while rain hammered against the pharmacy windows behind them. Then, after several long seconds of silence, Lena closed her eyes briefly and whispered the words like they physically hurt to say. "Myra's getting sick from the cold." Evelyn waited. When Lena finally looked back at her, her pride was still there, untouched, but exhaustion had begun breaking holes through it. "You can drive us home," she said carefully. "That's all." The drive across the city was quiet in a way that felt heavier than open conflict. Rain continued sliding down the car windows while the heater filled the back seat with dry warmth, but none of it seemed enough to loosen the tension sitting between Evelyn and Lena. Meera had fallen asleep halfway through the ride, curled carefully against her mother's side with both hands still clutching the pharmacy bag as if she was afraid someone might take it away. Evelyn sat across from them in silence, watching the reflection of passing streetlights move across the glass. Normally, after meetings like tonight's, she would already be reviewing tomorrow's press strategy or answering messages from the board. Instead, her attention kept drifting back toward the Omega sitting a few feet away. Lena looked exhausted enough to collapse again at any moment, yet she remained painfully alert whenever Evelyn moved too suddenly or looked at her for too long. It was not fear exactly, it felt more like habit. Like someone who had spent years learning how quickly safety could disappear. "Left here," Lena said quietly, as the car turned into an older neighborhood lined with narrow apartment buildings. The driver followed the direction without comment. A few minutes later, the car stopped in front of a worn brick building with flickering hallway lights visible through the entrance glass. Lena looked at the stairs behind the lobby doors and exhaled slowly, almost like she was preparing herself mentally before speaking. "3rd floor. No elevator." Evelyn opened the car door first and stepped into the cold night air. When she moved around the vehicle to help, Lena had already pushed herself out on her own. "You don't have to prove anything every second," Evelyn said before she could stop herself. Lena studied herself against the car briefly. "You think this is about pride?" Evelyn looked at her carefully. "Isn't it?" For a moment Lena said nothing. Then she glanced down at the sleeping child in her arms. "When people see an Omega collapse," she said quietly, "they stop asking what hurts and start asking who owns her." The answers settled heavily between them. Evelyn had no response ready this time. Inside the building, the hallway smelled faintly of old heating pipes and detergent. The stairwell lights buzzed softly overhead while Lena climbed carefully one step at a time, keeping Meera balanced against her shoulder despite the visible strain in her legs. Evelyn walked one step behind her the entire way, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to let her fall. Twice Lena's footing nearly slipped, and twice Evelyn's hand lifted instinctively before stopping midair. The restraint felt strangely difficult now that she had noticed how often her body reacted to Lena before her thoughts did. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, Lena's breathing had become uneven again. She unlocked the apartment door slowly and nudged it open with her shoulder. The apartment inside was small but clean in the careful way spaces became when someone spent enormous effort trying to keep life from unraveling completely. A folded blanket rested neatly over the couch. Children's crayons were stacked inside a cracked plastic container on the coffee table. A weak little basil plant sat near the kitchen window beside a row of medicine bottles arranged with precise attention. Nothing looked careless. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed. Nothing here belonged to someone who had given up. Lena lowered Meera gently onto the couch, brushing damp hair away from the girl's forehead before finally straightening fully. The movement clearly hurt. "You can leave after the rain slows," she said quietly, setting the pharmacy bag onto the counter. "Thank you for the ride." Evelyn did not answer immediately. Her eyes had already moved toward the refrigerator beside the kitchen doorway. Medical schedules were taped across the surface in organized rows: suppressive reminders, stabilizer dosage timing, heat risk monitoring, appointment notices. Several overdue bills sat clipped together beneath them. Evelyn had seen reports describing how difficult long-term pheromone disorders could become financially. Reports reduced everything into percentages and risk categories. Standing inside this apartment, she realized how clean those reports had sounded compared to reality. Lena noticed where she was looking. "You don't need to study it like a case file," she said flatly. Evelyn turned back toward her. "How long have you been stretching doses?" Lena opened the cabinet above the sink and took out a glass. "Long enough." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting tonight." Evelyn watched her pour water with visibly trembling hands. Even now, Lena was trying to hide the severity of her condition through control and routine. Her pheromones still drifted through the small apartment, weaker now than outside, but still present, still pressing against Evelyn's senses in ways that made her alpha instincts twitch uncomfortably beneath her skin. "Your body's rejecting the lower suppressive concentration," Evelyn said. "You shouldn't even be functioning normally." Lena laughed softly at that. It sounded exhausted more than amused. "You'd be surprised what people can survive when they don't have options." The words sat in the room for several seconds before Evelyn spoke again. "You applied for patient assistance." Lena froze slightly. Evelyn gestured toward a stack of papers partially visible beneath the bills. Cross Biotech logos covered the top pages. "You were denied." Lena drank a small amount of water before answering. "Missing documentation." "What documentation?" "One outdated tax form." Her voice remained calm, but bitterness pressed beneath every word. "Now. And my work income exceeded the limit by a few $100s. Evelyn frowned. "That shouldn't have automatically disqualified." "It did." Lena finally looked directly at her again. "Your system doesn't reject the poor, Evelyn. It rejects people who are too exhausted to survive paperwork while surviving everything else." The use of her first name caught Evelyn off guard more than the accusation did. For the first time tonight, Lena no longer sounded angry enough to fight. That somehow felt worse. Silence stretched between them while rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. Then a small sleepy voice mumbled from the couch. "Mama?" Lena moved immediately, crossing the room despite the stiffness in her legs. She knelt beside Meera and touched her forehead gently. "I'm here." Meera blinked slowly before looking past her toward Evelyn. "Did the scary alpha leave yet?" Evelyn almost smiled despite herself. "No," Lena answered quietly. "But she behaved herself." Meera considered that carefully with the seriousness only tired children possessed. Then she reached weakly toward Evelyn. "Can you help me sit up?" Evelyn hesitated for half a second before crouching beside the couch. Meera leaned against her trustingly while she adjusted the blanket around the girl's shoulders. The contact was small, innocent, but when Evelyn glanced up afterward, she found Lena staring at her with an unreadable expression. Not fear, not distrust. Something far more uncertain. As if she did not understand why seeing an alpha handle gentleness so naturally unsettled her more than aggression ever had. Meera drifted back to sleep quickly after that. Evelyn carefully lifted her and carried her toward the small bedroom doorway Lena pointed toward in silence. The room itself was simple. School books stacked neatly beside the bed, small drawings taped against the wall, a night light glowing softly near the window. Evelyn tucked the blanket around the sleeping child carefully before stepping back. When she returned to the living room, Lena had finally removed her damp outer coat. Exhaustion sat visibly across her face now that Meera was asleep and no longer watching her. "You don't have to stay," Lena said quietly. Evelyn nodded once. I know. But neither of them moved toward the door immediately. The room felt strangely still, not comfortable yet, but no longer openly hostile either. Lena's scent had softened further, barely perceptible now beneath the smell of rain and old carpet. Evelyn forced herself to breathe slowly, deliberately, fighting the pull that still lingered at the edges of her awareness. Then Lena disappeared briefly into the bathroom and returned holding Evelyn's folded blazer, now partially dried from careful handling. I cleaned it, she said, extending it toward her. Evelyn reached for the fabric automatically. The moment her fingers closed around it, the faint scent lingering against the collar hit her harder than expected. Lena's pheromones, soft now, weaker than before, but close enough that Evelyn's alpha instincts reacted sharply beneath her skin. Her breathing caught slightly. For one dangerous second, her body wanted something her mind had not yet allowed itself to name. Lena noticed the shift immediately. The air between them tightened. Evelyn forced herself to step backward first. Get some sleep, she said quietly. Then she turned and left before her instincts could betray her any further. Downstairs, inside the silent car, Evelyn finally unfolded the blazer fully before tossing it beside her. A small piece of folded paper slipped from the inner pocket onto her lap. She opened it slowly. The handwriting was messy and uneven, clearly written by a child. Thank you for not making Mama scared. Evelyn stared at the note for a very long time while rain continued sliding across the dark city outside the window. For the first time in years, sleep never came. 3 days after the pharmacy incident, the video leaked online. Not the full version, not the quiet moments beneath the rain, or the part where Evelyn stepped back when Lena asked her not to touch. Whoever uploaded it had cut the footage carefully, leaving only fragments that looked damaging enough to spread fast. Evelyn kneeling beside a distressed Omega. Evelyn handing over her black card. Lena looking exhausted and vulnerable under the pharmacy lights. The captions did the rest. Alpha CEO secretly paying off Omega researcher? Cross Biotech scandal. Kept Omega hidden after drug price outrage. By morning, the video was everywhere. Evelyn stood inside the executive conference room while PR teams argued over response strategies around her. Massive screens displayed headlines updating every few seconds while Celine Morel, head of public relations, paced near the glass wall with a tablet in her hand. We can still redirect the narrative, she said quickly. If we position this as compassionate outreach. No. Celine stopped. Evelyn, public sympathy is already shifting toward you. People love redemption stories. That Omega is not a campaign prop. The room went quiet for a second. Gareth Rill leaned back in his chair with visible irritation. Then at least release a statement denying inappropriate involvement. Evelyn's expression hardened immediately. There is no inappropriate involvement. Then say that publicly. Evelyn looked toward the paused image on the screen. Lena's face was partially visible in the frame, clearly distressed even through the grainy recording. Something cold settled heavily beneath her ribs. Remove every version showing the child, she said instead. I don't care how much legal pressure it takes. Celine exhaled slowly. We're trying, but the clips are already spreading too fast. Evelyn did not answer, because somewhere beneath the anger and exhaustion, another realization had begun pressing against her harder every hour since she left Lena's apartment. She remembered the scent lingering on her blazer. She remembered the way her alpha instincts had reacted. And worst of all, she remembered that she had not stopped thinking about it since. Across the city, Lena's week was becoming a nightmare. By the second day, people at the laundromat where she worked part-time had already recognized her from the leaked footage. Some treated her with awkward sympathy. Others stared openly. One customer had even asked if sleeping with rich alphas was how she paid for Seraphine. Lena nearly punched him. Instead, she locked herself in the staff bathroom afterward and forced herself through another suppressant injection with shaking hands. It barely worked anymore. Her body temperature had been rising since yesterday morning. The back of her neck ached constantly, and unstable pheromones slipped through her suppressants often enough that she had started avoiding crowded places entirely. Stress was accelerating the heat cycle. She knew the signs too well. That evening, when Meera finally fell asleep at home, Lena sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the last remaining Seraphine capsules in the bottle. 3 doses left. Maybe 4 if she split them again. Her phone buzzed suddenly across the table. An unknown number. Lena almost ignored it before finally answering. "Miss Dane," a smooth female voice said. "I believe we should speak." Lena's shoulders immediately tensed. "Who is this?" "Kaylin Arden." Silence. Even outside corporate circles, everyone knew the Arden name. Pharmaceutical investors, alpha-dominated holdings, ruthlessly influential. "I'm not interested," Lena replied flatly. "That's unfortunate," Kaylin said pleasantly, "because unlike Cross Biotech, I actually value useful omegas." Lena's expression darkened instantly. "Lose this number." She hung up before the woman could continue. 10 minutes later, someone knocked at the apartment door. Lena froze. The pheromone pressure outside hit her before she even reached the entrance. Alpha, strong, controlled, wrong. Meera stirred slightly from the bedroom, and panic immediately tightened through Lena's chest. She moved toward the door quietly and looked through the peephole. Kaylin Arden stood outside with 2 assistants behind her, perfectly composed beneath the hallway lights. "Miss Dane," Kaylin called calmly through the door. "I only want to talk." Lena did not answer. "Your suppressants are failing," Kaylin continued. "I can smell it from here." Humiliation hit almost harder than fear. Lena stepped back instinctively, pulse beginning to spike. The heat crashing through her body suddenly worsened, pain twisting sharply through her spine while unstable pheromones surged into the apartment air faster than the failing suppressants could contain them. Her breathing became uneven almost instantly. No, not now. Not with another alpha outside her door. Kaylin must have sensed the shift too, because her voice lowered slightly. "Open the door, Omega. Don't make this harder than necessary." Lena's vision blurred. Her body was beginning to respond to the alpha pressure automatically, betraying her in ways she hated more than physical pain itself. Her scent flooded the small apartment, desperate, fertile, available, and she hated every molecule of it. She pressed her back against the wall, trying to find purchase, trying to think. Then another scent entered the hallway. Sharp. Cold. Overwhelming. The pressure outside the apartment changed so suddenly that even Kaylin's assistants fell silent. Evelyn Cross had arrived. Lena did not even remember texting her. Somewhere earlier, while panic blurred her thoughts, she must have sent a message without fully realizing it. The hallway outside became deadly quiet. Evelyn spoke first, her voice calm enough to sound dangerous. "Step away from the door." Kaylin gave a soft laugh. "Interesting. I didn't realize Cross Biotech had become personally invested." I said step away. The alpha pressure flooding the hallway intensified, hard enough that Lena's weakened body reacted immediately. Her knees nearly gave out beneath her while her pulse spiraled further out of control. Outside, Kaylin's tone sharpened slightly. "Careful, Cross. You're upsetting her more." That was the wrong thing to say. Because for the first time since Lena met her, Evelyn's control visibly cracked. The alpha pheromones rolling through the hallway turned suffocating, cold enough to make even Kaylin step back half a pace. Lena's hands shook violently now. Not fear. The suppressants had fully failed. She barely managed to unlock the door before collapsing against the wall beside it. Evelyn moved instantly after entering, but stopped herself before touching her. Even now, Even like this. Lena, she said carefully, voice lower now. Look at me. Lena tried. Everything hurt. Heat burned through her body while conflicting alpha pheromones made breathing almost impossible. I can stabilize this, Evelyn said quietly. But I need permission. Kaylin scoffed from the hallway. You're asking now? Evelyn ignored her completely. Her eyes never left Lena's face. I need you to answer me clearly, she said. Do you want my help? Lena's chest tightened painfully. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to survive this alone, to never depend on an alpha again. But her body was failing faster every second, and Evelyn was still waiting, still asking, never forcing. Lena's eyes burned suddenly. She gave the smallest nod. Yes. The change in Evelyn's expression was immediate but controlled. Relief. Possessiveness. Fury. All buried beneath restraint so tight it almost looked painful. She finally stepped closer, her hand settling carefully against the back of Lena's neck, grounding rather than restraining. Controlled alpha pheromones slowly wrapped around the unstable chaos, flooding the apartment. Relief hit Lena hard enough that she almost hated herself for it. Her body responded to Evelyn's presence like a flower turning toward light, softening, opening, kneading. She hated how good it felt. She hated that her Omega instincts recognized this alpha as safe. Evelyn lowered her forehead briefly against Lena's temple. I'm going to mark you temporarily, she murmured softly. Only enough to stabilize the heat. Nothing more. Lena's breathing trembled. Okay. Outside the apartment, Kaylin stared at them silently for several seconds before finally stepping backward down the hallway. You're getting emotionally attached, Cross, she said calmly. That never ends well for alphas like us. Evelyn did not even look at her. Her focus remained entirely on the Omega trembling in her arms. When her teeth finally pressed carefully against the gland beneath Lena's neck, the world seemed to narrow into one terrifying realization. Neither of them wanted this to stay temporary anymore. Evelyn did not return to Lena's apartment for 4 days after the temporary mark. Officially, she buried herself in damage control meetings, legal briefings, and investor calls while Cross Biotech stock continued fluctuating under the pressure of public outrage. Unofficially, she stayed away because every instinct inside her had begun reacting to Lena in ways she no longer trusted. The temporary mark should have stabilized and faded into something manageable after the emergency passed. That was how these things worked. It was biology, not emotion, a controlled alpha response designed to protect omegas during dangerous pheromone crashes. At least that was what Evelyn kept telling herself. But every morning since that night, she woke with Lena's scent still trapped somewhere in her memory, soft and exhausted and impossibly familiar now. Worse than the scent itself was the realization that her body recognized it immediately. Her instincts had stopped categorizing Lena as someone temporary. That frightened her more than she wanted to admit. The media situation only made everything uglier. Rumors spread faster after the leaked pharmacy footage, and the heat incident somehow became public gossip within Omega forums and alpha investor circles alike. Anonymous posts accused Evelyn of exploiting a vulnerable Omega for sympathy. Others accused Lena of seducing the Cross Biotech CEO to gain access to expensive treatment. Neither side understood how humiliating all of it actually felt. By the 4th day, Celine Morel walked into Evelyn's office carrying 3 tablets and a visibly exhausted expression. You need to read this before the board meeting. Evelyn barely glanced up from the paperwork covering her desk. If it's another scandal article, summarize it. It's not media. Celine placed 1 tablet in front of her. It's internal. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at the screen. Someone had leaked confidential shareholder discussions online. Thousands of anonymous comments flooded beneath the documents. Already, many were openly hostile toward Omega's receiving long-term treatment support. Stop wasting company money on unstable omegas. Heat management isn't a corporate responsibility. If they can't afford suppressants, that's natural selection. Evelyn's jaw tightened slowly. Then she noticed something worse. A private photo of Lena leaving the laundromat with Meera had been uploaded beside the articles. Her expression changed instantly. Who leaked this? We're still tracking it. Take it down. We already filed requests. Evelyn stood abruptly enough that Celine fell silent. For the first time in years, she looked genuinely cautious around her boss. Find every source spreading information about the child, Evelyn said coldly. I don't care what legal department has to be threatened. Celine hesitated briefly. Evelyn, the board is already unhappy about how personally involved you've become. Evelyn laughed once under her breath, but there was no amusement in it. Personally involved, she repeated quietly. Interesting phrase coming from people who've never had to look patients in the eye. Before Celine could respond, another voice came from the office doorway. That attitude is exactly why we're here. Cedric Scott entered with Gareth Rill behind her. Even without speaking further, Cedric carried the kind of authority that made entire executive floors fall silent when she walked through them. She had trained Evelyn for years, shaping her into the precise, controlled executive investors trusted. Now she looked at her like a disappointing investment. The board meeting starts in 20 minutes, Cedric said. And before we begin, I strongly recommend you remember your position. Evelyn held her gaze calmly. My position seems very clear lately. You are not a social activist, Gareth added sharply. You are the CEO of a pharmaceutical corporation. Evelyn said nothing because a month ago that statement would have been enough to end the conversation. Now it only sounded hollow. The boardroom was already tense by the time Evelyn entered. Screens displayed market projections beside rapidly falling public trust numbers, while investors and executives murmured quietly around the massive conference table. No one bothered pretending the situation was under control anymore. Cedric opened first. Public outrage will stabilize if we avoid emotional responses and focus on recovery strategy, she said smoothly. What we cannot afford is impulsive restructuring driven by isolated incidents. Isolated incidents. Evelyn thought about Lena collapsing outside the pharmacy in freezing rain while her daughter counted quietly beside her to stop herself from panicking. Then she thought about those comments online, treating omegas like financial waste. Slowly, Evelyn opened the folder sitting in front of her. I reviewed long-term interruption data for Seraphine patients, she said evenly. The current support system is insufficient. Several board members immediately exchanged uncomfortable looks. Gareth sighed. Evelyn, we're restructuring the assistance program. Evelyn continued without stopping. Bridge doses will be supplied during insurance delays. Application requirements will be cut by more than half. And emergency heat stabilization support will become fully covered. The room erupted almost immediately. That's financially irresponsible. Do you understand the projected losses? Shareholders will never approve this. Cedric's expression hardened noticeably. You're making emotional decisions. No, Evelyn replied calmly. I'm finally making informed ones. She slid another document across the table. This was buried during the Seraphine acquisition. Cedric glanced down at the paper and went still. Several executives nearby leaned forward immediately. The document was old, partially archived, and signed by former researchers from the original stabilization project. The warning printed across the first page was impossible to misunderstand. Long-term interruption of Seraphine may trigger severe pheromone destabilization, neurological collapse, and emergency heat risk in Omega patients. Evelyn looked around the silent room carefully. We knew, she said quietly. Years ago. We knew exactly what interrupted access would do to these patients. Nobody answered immediately, because suddenly this was no longer about pricing strategy. Now it looked like negligence. Cedric finally spoke, her voice lower than before. Where did you get this? Evelyn did not answer the real question because she refused to drag Lena publicly into this room. Instead, she leaned back slightly and looked directly at the board members who had spent years discussing Omega healthcare like statistical inconvenience. We built a system where treatment exists only for people healthy enough to survive the process of earning it, she said. And every one of us sitting here allowed that to continue. Gareth slammed a hand against the table. You are destroying this company over one Omega. Evelyn's expression sharpened instantly. No, she said. I'm trying to stop us from becoming the kind of company that deserves to collapse. Silence crashed heavily through the boardroom after that. Cedric stared at her for several long seconds before finally speaking again. If you proceed with this publicly, she said carefully, the board will suspend you before the week ends. Evelyn looked toward the massive glass windows overlooking the city below. A few weeks ago, the threat would have terrified her. Now all she could picture was Lena standing in the rain, trying to stay upright, because collapsing in front of strangers felt more humiliating than physical pain. Slowly, Evelyn stood from her chair. Then suspend me. Several people started speaking at once, but Evelyn ignored them completely as she turned toward the door. Cedric's voice stopped her one final time. If you walk into that press conference tomorrow, Cedric warned, you will lose everything. Evelyn paused only briefly before answering. No, she said softly. For the first time, I think I finally understand what's worth losing it for. By the morning of the press conference, every major media outlet in the country was already waiting outside Cross Biotech headquarters. Reporters crowded behind security barriers while cameras flashed nonstop against the glass entrance of the building. Financial analysts predicted disaster. Shareholders demanded emergency intervention. Online discussions had split violently between people defending corporate necessity and people accusing Cross Biotech of exploiting vulnerable Omegas for years. Inside the executive floor, the atmosphere felt colder than the storm from the night Evelyn first met Lena. Celine stood near the conference room entrance holding a finalized speech prepared overnight by the legal department. Every paragraph had been carefully polished to reduce liability, soften accountability, and reassure investors without admitting fault. Evelyn barely glanced at it. You should at least read the opening section, Celine said quietly. If you go completely off script now, the board will come after you immediately. They already are. That doesn't mean you should hand them the knife yourself. Evelyn took the papers from her anyway. She skimmed the first page once before giving a short breath that almost sounded tired. Corporate language. Measured regret. Commitment to future improvement. Not one sentence in the entire document sounded human. She handed it back. I'm not using this. Celine closed her eyes briefly. Then at least try not to destroy yourself in there. Evelyn looked toward the large conference hall doors ahead of her. Through the narrow glass panels, she could already see the lights from dozens of cameras waiting inside. I think, she said quietly, that version of me was already falling apart before this started. Across the city, Lena sat alone in her apartment living room watching the broadcast countdown on an old television while Meera colored quietly on the floor nearby. The temporary mark beneath her neck had faded enough over the past weeks that the ache was mostly gone now. The traces of Evelyn's pheromones still lingered faintly during stressful moments. At first, Lena hated noticing it. She hated the calm that settled over her nervous system whenever Evelyn was near. She hated how naturally her body responded to an alpha after spending years teaching herself survival through isolation. But somewhere along the way, another realization had begun frightening her more. Evelyn had never once used that vulnerability against her. Not once. Meera looked up from her drawing suddenly. Mama? Do you think she's scared? Lena's eyes remained on the television screen for several seconds before answering. Yes, she said quietly. I think she finally is. Inside the conference hall, flashes exploded the moment Evelyn stepped behind the podium. Questions started immediately. Miss Cross, are you stepping down? Did Cross Biotech suppress internal research? Were Omega patients knowingly endangered? Evelyn stood silently until the noise settled enough for her to speak. For the first time in years, she did not look like the untouchable executive people we're used to seeing on financial broadcasts. She still wore the same tailored suit, still stood straight, still carried the same controlled presence, but something fundamental had changed in her expression. She looked like a woman no longer interested in protecting herself. Cross Biotech created Seraphine to stabilize Omega patients suffering from pheromone collapse syndrome. She began evenly. The treatment itself works. The research was groundbreaking. Lives were saved because of it. The room quieted further. Then Evelyn continued. But a treatment cannot truly save people if access to it depends entirely on wealth, paperwork endurance, and physical stability. Several executives watching from the side of the room visibly stiffened. Evelyn ignored them. Years ago, our company received warnings regarding the dangers of interrupted treatment access. Those warnings should have forced immediate reform. Instead, they were buried beneath financial priorities and acquisition strategy. Gasps spread quietly through the room. Some reporters immediately started typing. Others simply stared because no one had expected a CEO to admit this much publicly. Evelyn rested both hands lightly against the podium. We built a system where vulnerable Omega patients were expected to continuously prove they deserved survival, she said. And when they failed that process, we categorized it as unfortunate instead of unacceptable. Near the back of the hall, Cedric Scott closed her eyes briefly. The board had already prepared suspension paperwork before the conference even began. There was no saving Evelyn after this. But Evelyn no longer seemed interested in being saved. Effective immediately, she continued, Cross Biotech will establish emergency bridge dose coverage for unstable patients, reduce assistance application barriers, fund emergency heat stabilization care, and release quarterly transparency reports regarding treatment interruption cases. One reporter stood up immediately. Miss Cross, are you admitting your company harmed Omega patients? The room held its breath. Evelyn could have softened the answer. Any executive trained at her level would have. Instead, she answered honestly. Yes. The single word landed with devastating force. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. Not because the medicine failed, Evelyn said quietly afterward. Because we failed the people trying to reach it. Across the city, Lena stared silently at the television. Something painful tightened unexpectedly in her chest. Not pity, not triumph. Something worse. Because for the first time since they met, she realized Evelyn was truly giving something up. Not for reputation. Not for strategy. For real. The conference descended into chaos immediately after that. Reporters shouted questions over each other while stock alerts exploded across financial feeds in real time. Several executives left the room entirely. Others looked furious enough to walk out after them. Evelyn remained calm through all of it. By the time the broadcast ended, her suspension from Cross Biotech had already become official. 3 months later, the city felt quieter. Not magically fixed. Not transformed overnight. Systems that damaged people for years did not suddenly become kind because one alpha finally developed a conscience. But some things had changed. Bridge dose support programs had begun operating. Emergency Omega care funding passed public review after massive pressure. And most importantly, people had started paying attention to stories they used to ignore. Lena no longer split her medication into smaller doses to survive the month. Her treatment remained difficult, and some days her body still exhausted her faster than she wanted to admit, but the constant panic had finally eased enough for her to breathe without calculating survival every hour. She now worked part-time as an independent consultant reviewing Omega accessibility programs for the Reform Committee. Ironically, Evelyn attended most of those meetings too, not as CEO, just as herself. That afternoon, a small community health event filled one of the city halls with patients, volunteers, and advocacy staff discussing the new reforms. Meera had already disappeared toward the snack tables with other children, while Lena remained near the back entrance reading over paperwork. Then she noticed Evelyn approaching. For a second, neither of them spoke. There was still tension between them sometimes, but it no longer felt sharp or defensive. It felt careful. Real. "You're late," Lena said quietly. Evelyn glanced at the crowded hall. "I wasn't aware I was being monitored. I monitor people who create public disasters." Evelyn almost smiled at that. Almost. A volunteer called for participants to move toward the stage area at the front of the hall. Lena stepped forward automatically, but halfway up the short staircase, her leg stiffened hard enough to throw her balance slightly off. Before embarrassment could fully settle in, Evelyn moved beside her, not grabbing, not controlling, just offering her hand openly between them. The exact same way she had learned to do everything with Lena now. As a choice. Lena stared at the offered hand for several quiet seconds, while voices and movement continued softly around them. Months ago, she would have refused immediately, because survival had taught her that dependence always became dangerous eventually. But Evelyn had spent months proving something Lena no longer knew how to ignore, that protection and possession were not the same thing. Slowly, Lena placed her hand into Evelyn's. Warm fingers closed carefully around hers, steady without pressure. Then, before she could overthink it, Lena stepped closer and kissed her. The kiss was soft and brief, without spectacle or overwhelming pheromones. But it carried more honesty than anything either of them had said aloud before. When they finally pulled apart, Evelyn looked at her with the same stunned expression she had worn the first night outside the pharmacy. Lena huffed quietly under her breath. "Don't make that face." "What face?" "The one where you look like the world just surprised you." Evelyn's hand remained wrapped around hers. "That's because it did." For the first time in years, Lena laughed without exhaustion hiding underneath it. And this time, when they stood side by side beneath the bright lights of the crowded hall, neither of them felt like they were trying to survive alone anymore. And maybe, in the end, love was never about saving someone completely. Maybe it was simply about standing beside them long enough for them to believe they no longer had to fall alone. Extra story. The first time Evelyn Cross woke up in Lena Dane's bed, she woke up alone. Not abandoned, she realized that within the first few seconds of consciousness. The sheets beside her were still warm, and Lena's scent lingered on the pillow like a half-finished sentence. Evelyn pressed her face into the fabric and breathed it in without shame, because there was no one here to judge her for it. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sound of water running in the kitchen and the occasional clink of a mug being set down. Evelyn had been staying over more often lately. Neither of them had explicitly discussed it. There had been no conversation about what they were or what this meant. It had simply become easier, at some point, to stop going back to her empty penthouse after evenings that stretched late into the night. Easier to fall asleep with Lena's warmth beside her and wake to the sound of Meera's small feet padding across the floor. Easier. That was the word Evelyn used when she thought about it too much. But it wasn't quite accurate. What she felt for Lena was anything but easy. It was complicated and inconvenient, and entirely outside the carefully structured life she had built for herself. And she couldn't seem to stop. She pushed herself up, running a hand through her hair. The clock on the nightstand read 6:47. Early, but not unreasonably so. Through the thin walls, she could hear Lena humming something soft and tuneless. The sound made something in Evelyn's chest loosen, just slightly. She found Lena in the kitchen, standing at the counter in an old sweater that had slipped off one shoulder. Her dark hair was loose and still slightly tangled from sleep. She was pouring coffee into 2 mugs, her movements precise despite the early hour. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe and watched her for a moment, cataloging the details the way she cataloged everything else, the slight tremor in Lena's hands that had not entirely disappeared since the stabilizer regimen had stabilized, the pale lavender bruise at the base of her neck where the temporary mark had finally faded to almost nothing, the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating. "You're staring," Lena said without turning around. "I'm appreciating." Lena glanced over her shoulder, one eyebrow raised. "Is that what you're calling it?" "I'm a very precise woman." Evelyn pushed off from the door frame and crossed the kitchen, wrapping her arms around Lena's waist from behind. She pressed her nose against the curve of Lena's neck and breathed in. The scent that met her was warm and sleepy and undeniably Omega, but stable now, balanced in a way that no longer set off alarm bells in Evelyn's alpha instincts. Just present. Comfortable. Home. Lena leaned back against her for a moment, her hands coming up to rest over Evelyn's. "Meera's still asleep. You have time to stop being a menace before she wakes up." "I'm never a menace." "You're absolutely a menace." But Lena's voice was soft, amused. She turned in Evelyn's arms and looked up at her. "You're also ridiculous. And you slept through your alarm." "I didn't hear it." "You never do anymore." Lena reached up and brushed a strand of hair from Evelyn's forehead. "You've been sleeping better." "That's good." Evelyn said nothing. She had noticed it too, the way her insomnia had loosened its grip over the past few months. She could still remember those nights after the press conference, lying awake in her penthouse with Lena's scent still clinging to her blazer, replaying every moment of that first meeting. The insomnia had been a constant companion for as long as she could remember. Now, in Lena's cramped apartment with its creaky floorboards and thin walls, and the occasional sound of a neighbor's dog barking, she slept like she had nowhere else to be. "That's because of you," she said quietly. "I think you know that." Lena's expression softened. "I know." She reached for one of the coffee mugs and pressed it into Evelyn's hands. "Drink. You need caffeine before you get sentimental." "I don't get sentimental." "You get extremely sentimental." "It's alarming." "You're supposed to be the cold-hearted CEO." "I was suspended," Evelyn said dryly. "My cold-hearted CEO privileges were revoked." Lena laughed, and the sound of it was still strange to Evelyn, strange and wonderful, because she had heard Lena laugh so rarely in those first weeks. Every laugh had been a hard-won victory. Now they came more easily, and Evelyn hoarded each one like a private treasure. By noon, Evelyn had convinced Lena to leave the apartment. It wasn't difficult. Lena had been restless all morning, her movements edgier than usual, her attention drifting. Evelyn had noticed the signs before Lena herself seemed to acknowledge them. "You need sunlight," Evelyn said, pulling on her coat. "I need to finish the quarterly reports for the Reform Committee." "You need sunlight," Evelyn repeated. "The reports will still be there when you get back." Lena opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She had been doing that more lately, stopping herself before she could push Evelyn away. Old habits, Evelyn knew. Survival habits. They were both still learning to unlearn them. The park was only a few blocks away. They walked in comfortable silence, their shoulders brushing occasionally. Evelyn kept her hands in her pockets, resisting the urge to reach for Lena's. Public displays of affection were still something Lena struggled with, not because she didn't want it, Evelyn had learned, but because she had spent so long being watched and judged and reduced to her biology that any attention felt dangerous. But when they found a bench near the pond, Lena sat close enough that their thighs pressed together. Evelyn took that as permission and let her hand drift to rest on Lena's knee. "You're warm," Lena said, frowning slightly. Evelyn's instincts sharpened immediately. She looked at Lena more closely, cataloging the signs she had learned to read over the past months. The flush across Lena's cheeks, the slight dilation of her pupils, the way her scent had shifted from its usual calm equilibrium to something deeper, richer, warmer. "Lena, I'm fine." "You're not fine." Evelyn's voice was careful, controlled. "When was your last suppressant injection?" Lena looked away. "I'm due." "How overdue?" "A couple days." The admission came out reluctantly. I thought I could stretch it. The cost has gone down, but it's still." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "You can't stretch suppressants. You know that. We've talked about this." "I know." Lena's hands were gripping the edge of the bench. I hate being dependent on them. I hate needing." "Needing what?" Lena met her eyes then, and Evelyn saw the fear there, the deep, unshakable fear of her own biology, of what it meant to be an Omega in a world that had taught her she was nothing but a body to be controlled. "I hate needing you this way," Lena whispered. "I hate that my body responds to you like I can't survive without you." Evelyn felt the words hit her like a physical blow. She had suspected this, of course. She had seen the way Lena sometimes pulled back, the moments of distance that appeared without warning. But hearing it spoken aloud was something else entirely. "Lena." She waited until Lena met her eyes again. "I don't need you to survive without me. I need you to want me. Not because your biology says so. Because you choose me." Lena's breath caught. Her scent was growing stronger now, more insistent, pressing against Evelyn's alpha instincts like a plea she couldn't ignore. Evelyn forced herself to breathe slowly, to maintain control even as her body screamed at her to respond. "Your heat is coming," Evelyn said quietly. "Soon. You need to let me help you. But only if you want it. Only if you choose it." They made it back to the apartment with minutes to spare. Meera was at a friend's house for the afternoon, a stroke of luck Lena had arranged earlier, as if some part of her had known what was coming. Evelyn locked the door behind them and turned to find Lena already swaying on her feet, her cheeks flushed, her eyes dark with want and fear and something that might have been relief. "Evelyn." Her voice was thinner now, less certain. "I don't." "I know." Evelyn crossed the room and took Lena's hands in hers. "I know. We don't have to do anything you don't want." "That's not," Lena's breath hitched. "That's not what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of wanting it too much. I'm afraid that if I let myself want this, want you, I'll lose myself completely." Evelyn reached up and cupped Lena's face, her thumb stroking across her cheekbone. "You won't. You're the strongest person I've ever met. You've survived things that would have broken anyone else. Your biology doesn't define you. But it's part of you, and I want all of you, Lena. The parts you're proud of and the parts you wish you could cut away." Lena's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You really mean that?" "I really mean it." Evelyn leaned forward and pressed her forehead against Lena's. "I love you. All of you. Every complicated, inconvenient, beautiful part." The words hung between them. Evelyn hadn't planned to say them, not like this, not yet, but they had been building inside her for months. Since the rain-slicked pavement outside the pharmacy. Since Lena's shaking hands and fierce pride. Since Meera's small face and messy handwriting. Lena kissed her then, fierce and desperate, her Omega pheromones flooding the space between them. Evelyn responded without hesitation, her alpha instincts surging to meet Lena's need. But even as her body took over, Evelyn kept her mind present, kept her touch gentle, kept asking for permission with every movement. "Tell me what you want," Evelyn murmured against Lena's lips. "You," Lena breathed. "I want you." "Good. Because I'm not going anywhere." Evelyn's body responded to the pheromones like a match to kindling. She had spent years training herself to ignore her instincts, to override the biological programming that made alphas possessive and territorial. But with Lena, the training fell away like an old skin she no longer needed. Her alpha instinct recognized Lena as hers, not as property, not as a possession, but as someone she was meant to protect, to cherish, to love. She carried Lena to the bedroom, settling her carefully on the bed. Lena reached for her, her fingers tangling in Evelyn's shirt, pulling her close. "Stay with me," Lena whispered. "Don't leave." "Never," Evelyn promised. "I'm right here." The heat was crashing through Lena now, her pheromones flooding the room with warmth and need. Evelyn's alpha instinct wanted to take over, to claim and mark and possess. But Evelyn held herself back, focusing on the woman beneath her. Lena was trembling, overwhelmed, but there was something else in her eyes. "Trust." "Evelyn," Lena gasped. "Please. Please, what love?" Evelyn lowered her mouth to Lena's throat. "Tell me what you need." "Your mark." Lena's voice broke. I want to be yours. Truly yours. Not temporary. Not an emergency." Evelyn pulled back just enough to meet Lena's eyes. "You're sure?" "This isn't. It's permanent, Lena. Once I do this, my scent will be on you forever. Other alphas will know. Everyone will know." Lena's hand came up to touch Evelyn's cheek. "I want them to know. I want everyone to know I'm yours, just as much as you're mine." Evelyn felt her chest tighten with emotion so overwhelming she could barely breathe. She had been so afraid of this, of wanting too much, of taking something Lena couldn't freely give. But Lena was giving it. Freely, willingly, completely. "Lena." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I love you. I've loved you since the night you collapsed in the rain. I just didn't know how to name it." "You were terrible at it," Lena managed. "Absolutely terrible." "I know." Evelyn laughed softly, her lips brushing against Lena's throat. "I'm better now." She lowered her mouth to the gland beneath Lena's ear, the same place she had marked her that first night. But this was different. This was permanent. This was a choice, not an emergency. "Do it," Lena breathed. "Please. I'm ready." Evelyn's canines extended, sharp and instinctive. She pressed her teeth against the soft skin, and when she bit down, Lena cried out not in pain, but in relief. Evelyn's pheromones flooded into the wound, bonding them together in the most primal way. Lena's body arched beneath her, heat and pleasure and completion washing over her in waves. When Evelyn pulled back, the mark was glowing faintly, a deep pink against Lena's pale skin. It would fade to a permanent mark over the next few days, a visible sign of the bond between them. Evelyn pressed a kiss to it, feeling the rush of her own pheromones settle, feeling Lena's body relax beneath her. "Are you okay?" Evelyn asked, searching Lena's face. Lena's eyes were still wet with tears, but she was smiling. "I'm wonderful." She laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I'm yours, Evelyn. Finally. Completely." Evelyn gathered her close, wrapping her arms around her Omega. Lena's scent was everywhere now, warm and sweet and saturated with Evelyn's own alpha pheromones. The combination should have been overwhelming, but instead it was right. Perfect. "Are you okay?" Lena asked, her voice small. Evelyn pressed her nose into Lena's hair. "I'm better than okay. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." 2 hours later, they lay tangled together in the afternoon light. The room smelled like them now, Alpha and Omega mingled together, inseparable. Evelyn's hand traced lazy patterns on Lena's bare shoulder. "We'll need to be careful for a while," Evelyn said quietly. "The bond needs time to stabilize." Lena nodded against her chest. "I know. I read about it." "Of course you did." Evelyn smiled. "You probably read the entire medical literature on bonding before we even had this conversation." "I wanted to be prepared." Lena tilted her head back to look at her. I wanted to know what I was getting into. And what did you decide? Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up and touched the new mark on her throat, her fingers brushing over it gently. I decided it was worth it. You were worth it. Evelyn kissed the top of her head. I love you, Lena Dane. I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. Lena laughed, soft and easy. You already are. Later, when Meera came home, she went straight to her mother and frowned at the mark on her neck. Mama, what's that? Lena glanced at Evelyn, who was trying very hard not to look guilty. It's a special mark, Lena said carefully. It means I belong to someone who loves me very much. Meera turned to Evelyn with a critical expression. You love my mama? I do, Evelyn said. Very much. Meera considered this for a moment. Then she nodded decisively. Okay, you can stay. She climbed onto the couch between them, settling in like she belonged there. Can we watch cartoons now? Lena laughed. Yes, baby. We can watch cartoons. Evelyn watched them both, Lena with her new mark and her tired smile, Meera with her serious eyes and her small, trusting hands, and felt something expand in her chest. It wasn't the cold, familiar satisfaction of a deal closing or a crisis averted. It was something warmer, softer. Home, she thought. This is what home feels like. The city was still the same, loud and chaotic, and full of people struggling and failing and surviving. The news cycles would still churn. The board would still be furious. The world wouldn't stop turning because two women had finally found their way to each other. But in this small apartment, with Lena's scent all around her and Myra's small hand in hers, Evelyn Cross had never been more certain of anything in her life. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was living. And she intended to live every moment of it. The end.